Welcome back to Lit Friday, Augustonians, and welcome if you are joining us for the first time. If you're new, Lit Friday is a monthly virtual conversation program from the August Wilson African American Cultural Center. Held on the final Friday of every month, we feature writers and artists of the African diaspora and talk about their work and its intersection with the contemporary moment. I'm Jessica Lanay, the curator and host. I'm also an art journalist and poet. To keep up with my work, you can follow me on Instagram at @hanginthere_kitty. To keep up with other amazing August Wilson African American Cultural Center events, including Lit Friday, follow the center on Instagram at August Wilson Cultural Center. Before we welcome and introduce our incredible guest, Airea, let's synchronize our calendars. It is a busy June, so I will encourage you to visit our website at awaacc.org for the latest and share the highlights with you here. On June 15th, we are screening the documentary Pa Joe and the Lion as part of public programming for the exhibition I co-curated with Kimberly Jacobs, Abebui Adekai, Proverb Boxes for a Life Well Traveled by Jacob Pa Joe Jr. The documentary focuses on the contemporary aesthetics of the father-son coffin maker duo, Joseph and Jacob Pa Joe, located in Ghana. Their works have been exhibited throughout Europe and the United States and feature colorful coffins sculpted to resemble objects treasured by the departed. On June 18th, we have our Juneteenth celebration and jazz pianist Howie Alexander. On June 20th, we have our intermission, the Artful Happy Hour series. June 28th, Lit Friday is back with you with poet Nicholas Goodley joining us for conversation and a reading of his publication, Black Swim. And as well on June 28th, the August Wilson African American Cultural Center celebrates Pride Month, hosted by Knox, featuring performances from Leah, Neek James, Miss Money, Sia, and DJ Rojo. Again, visit the website at awaacc.org and follow the August Wilson African American Cultural Center on Instagram at August Wilson Cultural Center. Now I have the honor of introducing you to Airea D. Matthews. Airea D. Matthews' first collection of poems is the critically acclaimed Simulacra, read it back to front 100 times, which received the prestigious 2016 Yale Series of Younger Poets Award. Matthews is also the author of Bread and Circus, which we'll be discussing today. Beautiful, amazing, incredible. It's a memoir-in-verse that combines poetry, prose, and imagery to explore the realities of economic necessity, marginal poverty, and commodification through a personal lens. Matthews received a 2020 Pew Fellowship, a 2016 Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award, and was awarded the Louis Untermeyer Scholarship in Poetry from the 2016 Bread Loaf Writers Conference. Matthews earned her MFA from the Helen Zell Writers Program at the University of Michigan. In 2012, she was named Philadelphia's Poet Laureate. She is an assistant professor at Bryn Mawr College, where she directs the poetry program. It's an honor to have you. Congratulations on all of your accolades. I also read that your son was also the Youth Poet Laureate of Philadelphia, like you were the year after, or like a year or two after. That's incredible.
Yeah. He paved the way for me, and I just kind of followed in his footsteps.
I think that is incredible, and I can't wait to talk to you more about that. But even more eager, if I could possibly be more eager, I would love to hear you read from Bread and Circus.
Oh, it'd be my pleasure. I think I'm going to read two poems today. I'll start with In the Beginning, and then we'll move over into what seems more like the present. The Troubles. Man watches his history on the screen with apathy and an occasional passing flicker of horror and indignation. Connor Cruz O'Brien, Irish historian. It's January 1972, and inside, Ma's television buzzes. Oddly accented men wearing crucifixes call for work and housing. Children's coattails drag along the seats of burnt-out cars, walling in their free dairy. Tanks thrum through the rubble thrown, stones ricochet off umbrella shields, bullets plunge into some husband's flesh like rose thorns burrowing chest deep. A priest waves a handkerchief as flag of surrender, begging passage for the shallow breath whose blood slicks his boot. Unknowns will die cradled in the arms of strangers who moments earlier sang, "We shall overcome someday," faithfully clinging to that same distant hope that finds Ma thousands of miles away on a different continent, wailing on her bedroom floor, arms flailed across her belly, mourning an unwanted whose spine swims against her backbone's curve, holding vigil for blood that will not come, and me who surely will. Sorry, that was my dog in the background. You could hear him. He's a lot loud and 170 pounds. So I kind of let him do what he does. Etymology. Because my mother named me after a child born still to a godmother I've never met, I took another way to be known. Something easier to remember, inevitable to forget, something that rolls over the surface of thrush, because I grew tired of saying, no, it's pronounced. Now I tire of not conjuring that ghost I honor. Say it with me. Era. Rhymes with Sarah. Sarah from the Latin meaning a woman of high rank, which also means whenever I ask anyone to hold me on their lips, I sound like what I almost am. Hear me out. I'm not a D or a river charging through working class towns where union folk cog wedge for plots and barely any house at all, where bosses mangle ethnic phonemes and nobody corrects one word because the check's in the mail. So let's end this classist pretense where names don't matter and language is too heavy a lift. My E is silent, like most people should be. The consonant is sonorant, is a Black woman, or one might say the spine. I translate to wind in a country known for its iron, implied lioness of God in Jesus's tongue, mean apex predator, free of known enemy, fierce enough to harm or fast enough to run. All I'm saying is what I've already said. The tongue has no wings to flee what syllables it fears. The mouth is no womb, has no right to consume what it did not make.
That would have been one of the poems I requested if I hit special request mode. But you didn't read the one I have a special request for. So closer to the end, I'll make sure I try to fit that in.
Oh, sure. Just let me know and I'm happy to read it.
I want to return to the conversation we opened up with about your son, Wes. And I think this is a perfect moment. And just for the audience, from 2018 to 2019, Wes Matthews was Youth Poet Laureate of Philadelphia. And from 2023 to 2022 to 2023, you were the Philadelphia Poet Laureate. And seeing this trajectory across generations wants me to begin simply, how did literature appear in your life? How did you make it stay? And how do you engage in the everyday with it, especially in terms of your family dynamics? Because there's obviously a great shared influence here.
Yeah, it's interesting. So Wes is the former Youth Poet Laureate of Philadelphia. My oldest son just graduated from grad school where he took a degree in sports broadcasting or sports journalism.
Incredible.
And my youngest child, who's a girl, her name is Willow, she absolutely adores writing and is probably well on her way to writing just very compelling YA prose. So it's been a tradition in this household, at least, where my kids have picked up on this love that I have of language. And I suppose that it started, it's interesting. My kids always say that I have a buffering delay. So they'll ask me something and it takes me a minute to answer. So I'll have heard the question, but I'll need some time to process it. And that's just how I've always been. because I don't want to give you a standard answer. I want to actually think about what you've asked me. And, once they asked, what happens in the space between the time that I ask you a question and the time that you answer the question?
Mm.
And I said, thought, right? Thought is happening. And so I've impressed upon them how critical it is to give yourself over to thinking, not only to thinking, but to eventually doing, right? But the first step towards doing a thing is thinking through it.
Mm-hmm.
And I consider thinking a part of writing. And I've always told them that thinking is the first step to writing. I mean, if you don't have any real questions and you don't have there's no demand or there's no need for you to get to the page. If you already know everything, if you already think that whether it's reading or writing, there's no demand for the page. And so you have to kind of enter in with this spirit of humility. And I think some of the pretense behind having a quick and ready answer is this idea that we're supposed to know everything already.
Mm.
And so I raised them with this sense of curiosity and wonder, and not necessarily to jump to the quick thought is not usually the right thought, in my opinion. It's not usually, it's the thought that you give under duress, or it's the thought that you give under the expectation that you're supposed to readily answer something. But what I'm really compelled by is the thing that you give time and attention to. So I've always, kind of taught them to be cognizant of your thought life, be cognizant of how you think. As you think, so you do. And I raised them in a house full of books. So they would see me reading. I mean, my kids are mostly grown now. I only have one child that's still home. But, I raised them in a household where they have books. And they not only do they have books, but they have ways to have conversations around what they read. So it's not that it's just you're processing a book or you've read a book, but that you have the ability to talk through it, which I think is an important component of understanding or comprehension. And that's actually very much the opposite of the way that I came up. I didn't grow up in a house full of books, but I always had questions. And my mother, she worked a great deal, just an incredible amount of time. She had 3 jobs. So there wasn't someone who I could readily ask, what does this mean to you? Or just come into the room and ask a philosophical question. So I had to develop this very rich inner life in which I became that person. So it's kind of, I probably, some sort of, there's you in your head, there's you, but then there's this other you who's able to posit some other thoughts. So I've kind of lived with this idea of duality in my thought life, which is in keeping with my Mercury, which is Libra. I'm kind of trying to always be balanced, and or at least as it relates to communication and thought. And it was utterly important for me to create the kind of household that I've always wanted, which is one in which your kids have the ability to develop critical thinking skills. Mm-hmm. Because I think that's what makes you a force, right? It's not just that you receive and you take in the whatever the stimuli is around you. It's that you can think through it logically, sensibly, with heart, right? Not just logic and sense, but also emotion. And so that you can think through kind of all of the different facets of any sort of complex problem and hold them, because that's where nuance comes from. I'm a big fan of nuance. So, which is hard to do in your parenting too, because, parents are supposed to be hardline. It's supposed to be black and white, but I have not raised my children with a sense of those types of binaries.
This also sounds like
right
a way to build confidence, cognitive confidence in oneself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. It's like, oh, well, there's this thing that I read many years ago was like, oh, I talk to myself because I'm pretty good company. And I had to adopt that, right? Because I didn't have people around me who I could just readily ask, what's the meaning of life? There was no time for that. People were working, they were busy. They didn't have time to think about the meaning of life because they were trying to live.
And the answer you might have gotten may not have been a nice one.
And the answer I may have gotten may not have been the one that would have caused me to like dig deeper or think deeper, or, and so I kind of had to be that for myself. And then over time, you kind of develop friendships and you develop alliances with people and mentorships. You can be a mentee where you can have those kinds of interactions. And it was critical for me. Just as I first considered myself a thinker, but it was critical for me as a thinker and recognizing myself as a thinker, because not everybody does, to say, oh, well, of course, I have to be able to posit questions, but also be able to find answers. And I'm not saying that I was the source of those answers, but what was the source of those answers for me that I would later find are books. I'd consult with other thinkers and see what they had to say. So then you get the influence of other writers or thinkers in the world, and you can sort of enter into conversations with them. And in both of my books, I've done that. I really believe in polyvocality. We are composed of so many different trains of thought. We're composed of so many different ideas, both theoretical and practical. And how do you reconcile those? And that's kind of what I'm searching for in my work, is how do you reconcile the quotidian with the intellectually sublime?
Right.
And
does theory really ruin poetry, or?
Yeah. And how theory can animate poetry, right? Like when you start thinking about the whole idea of criticism is that, you're being looked at or examined along the lines of the traditions in the field, or how you are innovating inside of some sort of new movement.
Mm-hmm.
And that's theory. That's literary theory. Like thinking about what comes before, thinking about how you fit in, thinking about how you change out of that. And I've always been very interested in it, even though I never studied it. I've just been interested in it. So my interest, I felt like, was not necessarily a scholarly interest. It was the interest of a layman or a laywoman who wanted to better understand the world and could better understand it through the thinkers that came before. No matter how much I disagree with them, because I can actually look at or read someone, completely disagree with what they're saying, but recognize the value of what they're saying.
Right.
See some degree of truth in what they're saying, even if I disagree with their ideas.
Or what can you gain? What can you see of them while they're telling their truth? What can you discern about this creator, this writer, this thinker, based on the perspective that they're sharing?
Exactly. Like one wouldn't readily discern. So I was interested in Adam Smith when I was writing Bread and Circus. And one wouldn't readily discern that when this cat was writing The Wealth of Nations, he was living with his mama. I mean, it's kind of easy to write about, exchange, which is really what capitalism is supposed to be, when you are in this sort of very privileged situation where you can be taken care of. Mm-hmm. And you can think about you can posit the merits of such a system when you are, in fact, being taken care of. It's harder to work through how capitalism actually works when you are on the other end of it. You're not on the receiving end of its privilege.
The standards of citation being very different at the time, right? Like,
absolutely.
Of course, when you're sitting and making an observation of the way exchange works directly in front of you, you can philosophize about this, but some of the commentary I'm like making in the book, when you share the repeated passages from Adam Smith and oh my goodness, Debord, right? Debord again.
Yeah.
I keep arguing with them because I'm like, this is actually like a forced kind of system, right? That cannot continue without some sense of altruism or community. And so you realize how, while very extensive what they've created, it has a very narrow world in which it can be successful, right? And I think your book,
very world in which it can.
The autobiographical in Bread and Circus shows the failure of their theory. It shows how the theory is incommensurate with actual living. Can you talk a little bit about So you posit these two endpoints, right? From the first question, it's
Mm-hmm.
your home being as you've always wanted it to be your home as it was in your formative years. What was the bridge between the two? You as a writer, how did you grow? What institutions did you kind of go through? What was your path to kind of saying, no, I'm going to take all the risk and do this?
It's interesting. I've always been incredibly blessed by a support system that is otherworldly. And I say otherworldly because a lot of my interventions have felt divine in some sort of way. So when I was living in Detroit, I was living in Detroit, and it's the early 2000s at the time, and I was saying to myself, I really want to be a writer. And even in the 90s, I knew I wanted to be a writer, but I graduated from college in 94. I took a degree in economics. I always thought that I would go into business, thought that I was supposed to go into business, and did so for almost a decade. I worked in corporate America for almost a decade, and I hated every minute of it, and I mean, like really hated, like that deep-seated hate that Kendrick spewed in Euphoria. It's like, I hate the way you walk, hate the way you talk, I hate the way you dress. It's like, it's how I felt about corporate America. And I was like, I got to get out of here, but I don't really know what my calling is. And I just really always wanted to write. So even when I was in graduate school in public policy, I was like writing these briefs that were sort of ostentatious. They were ornamental in a lot of different ways. It was just like they had this kind of these flourishes of language that is really not ones that you need in a policy brief. And I was working under. She would go on to be appointed by Barack Obama. Her name, the late Becky Blank, and she was the dean of the school. And I remember she was also one of my independent study advisors, my thesis advisor. And I remember sitting in her office and she said, you write these like a poet would. It's not, you're writing these briefs. She's like, they're interesting, but you're writing them like a poet would. And at the Ford School, they had a writing tutor. So I went to go talk to the writing tutor because I felt like it was something I needed to change about the way that I was writing. And she was like, well, have you considered the MFA program, the Masters of Fine Arts? Because that's the direction that these briefs are taking. They're becoming like art objects. They're not necessarily, yes, you're dealing with something, but they are in themselves art objects. So I kind of sat with that for years, got involved in slam, realized that slam wasn't what I really wanted for my career, and met a mentor, and her name is Vivi Francis. And actually, I don't know if you know Vivi. You know Vivi.
She was, of course, the one of the two brilliant duo in Callaloo at Brown.
Exactly.
So yes, I have taken workshops with Vivi, absolutely.
Exactly. So we were both in Detroit, and I would sit at her feet every week, a couple times a week, I think. Actually, it was when my daughter was a newborn. Now my daughter is almost 14 now. But when she was a newborn, I would sit there and I would breastfeed her as I was listening to Vivi sort of give me these mini lectures about poetry and the importance of language. And I was taking all this in. I was in my late 30s, and I was taking all this in. And was like, this is exactly what I want to do. I just want to talk about poems, and I want to write poems that outlive me. So she kind of was the person that gave me the model for possibility. Just sitting at her feet, just saying, I don't know what I know, but I don't know everything that I can know, but I want to know what I don't. And then kind of developing those relationships over time. So I was in Cave Canem. Cave Canem was a very formative experience for me. I was in Callaloo. Callaloo was an incredibly formative experience for me. And then step by step by step, I slowly initiated the process of becoming a poet, which I think is what it is. I don't necessarily think that you start to write a poem and automatically you're a poet. There's a training that happens.
Yes.
And in the same way that one would be trained for a science, right? You don't come out of undergrad and be like, I'm a scientist. You go through the process of becoming one. And I was slowly over time becoming a poet. And it just struck me as the type of life that I'd always wanted for myself because I was happy doing it. It didn't feel like a burden to come to the page. And sometimes it does, don't get me wrong. Like sometimes it feels very burdensome to come to anything, any computer screen, anything. But it was something I wanted to do. I wanted to take on that burden, whatever it looked like. I wanted to take it on. And that's how my becoming started. That she was pivotal in helping me to get ready for the MFA program. She wrote one of my recommendations. She looked out for me in ways that I don't even know. You know, like I still to this day don't know the ways in which she looked out for me, but I know that she did. And that's one of the things I seek to be in our community. I really want to mentor people who are serious about the craft of poetry. Everything else aside, the landscape, the business of it, the economics, just everything aside. Like, how do you create a way for people to come in and move through? And even in some instances, eclipse. You know, you want them in the same way that I want my children to be better than I am, to do, to experience life to their fullest and to never ever spend a day doing anything that they don't love, they don't have a passion for, they're not good at. I want that same for young poets. And so I think it's just because that was the foundation that was laid for me. So that's the answer to the question on the slow becoming of a poet. It's having doors opened and having hearts open, more than doors, because doors seems too opportunistic and seems very capitalistic in its kind of intent. It was really heart.
That gatekeeping that's becoming more like
exactly
common parlance now. It used to be something I only heard artists say. Now many more people are recognizing like, oh, there are kind of like a guard of certain people in any field, and one of those doors has to open, which creates this gatekeeping dynamic that everybody thinks is the main or only one.
Absolutely. And my analogy is how do we open hearts to what we do, right? And an open heart does not mean that you just mentor or that you look out for people who write in the same vein that you do. I think the best teachers, the best mentors are people who have broad aesthetics and mentor people who write very differently from them. So Vivi writes in the fashion of, and she's now just my sister for sure, but and that's the beautiful thing is like eventually your mentors you'll all move together in the field and you will become kin. And I don't want to ever be the person who only teaches in one aesthetic or only teaches toward one thing. I want to be the person that sees possibility in all things, right? Who reads broadly. Because I read broadly, I can appreciate literature in its vastness. And that means because literature is so vast, there will be people who write very differently than me. And I'm for that. I'm really for that. Actually, as I'm sitting here talking to you, I just got an idea about a book of poems. Thank you.
Yes. And when that one's published, you can come right back and we'll discuss it again. So
like, how cool would it be to have a whole collection of abstracts? Because I love, when you read those scholarly articles or peer-reviewed articles, and they've got the abstract, I was just thinking like, those are the best part of the thing for me. It's like the summary of everything that they're about to tell you.
It's the poeticization of the whole entire thing that you're trying to do in like 30 to 60 pages.
Precisely.
And the abstract, every scholar, academic I've ever met is like, no, the abstract is the hardest thing. You're better off writing out the whole proposal like as a draft for your abstract. Like your final version of your proposal is the draft of your abstract, which shouldn't be more than 100 words.
Yeah, exactly. It can't be like more than 100 words. So there you've got that constraint. And so whenever I feel the constraint happening, I'm like, oh, that feels like that's poetic territory because you're putting the constraint in there.
Could have been, right? But a better title.
Exactly.
So thinking of mentorship, right? Like books are mentors, right? I wanted to say when you were talking about, what literature and reading meant to you and thinking in your formative years, I was like, there was no better babysitter for me than the public library.
Word.
I could read what I wanted. The librarians looked out for me. Like, I was always in the same place, reading whatever I could get my hands on. And in some ways, when you find your favorite authors, they become mentors if you find yourself mentorless. And so I wanted to ask about your intimate relationship with Guy Debord and Adam Smith, because you engage their works deeply here. So deeply, it's like, no, there's a conversation happening. I feel this way about Sandor Ferenczi, who was Sigmund Freud's like protege, right? Like, I feel like I'm arguing with him all the time about thalassophobia, this theory of everyone attempting to return to the womb. That's my dead conversation, like conversation with dead person. So I wanted to know more about this continuing relationship with these two theorists in terms of your own writing and life.
Yeah. So I find them to be theorists. I find them to be slightly misunderstood, right? So Smith in particular, because I think people see Adam Smith as the founder, or if for lack of a better word, the person that the person whose book, The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776, lays the foundation for classical free market economics, or capitalism as we know it. And there are some key insights, though, however, if you read that tome, which is ridiculously long. This is just why I extracted it the way that I did. It's crazy long. It does give some key insights into the benefits of division of labor. And when I started thinking about that division of labor, something about the division of labor is a concept in which it concretizes class, right? This class of people does this work. This class of people does that work. And then Smith also forwarded an idea of the invisible hand, which is simply a theory about self-interest. And the idea is that self-interest creates these optimal economic outcomes. And the reality for me was just the opposite. That's what I'm saying. Like, I can read somebody and I can disagree with them. The invisible hand never worked for me.
No.
I grew up in the 80s where, the entire government was grounded and very much propelled forward by this idea of free market, trickle down economics, free market, the benefits of free market. And I saw it working just the opposite. And so I wanted to set him up as someone in conversation, because I wanted to disagree with him. I wanted to throw the words back into space and have them be read in a different way. And the same thing with Debord. Debord, it was a Hegelian Marxist, which is basically just a Marxist who believes that you can own property. And he published the Society of the Spectacle in 1967. And the Society of the Spectacle, kind of in the same way as Marshall McLuhan, who is another kind of writer who is in that same vein, had sort of a futurist view of the effects of capitalism and consumption. So I began to consider what lives in that interstitial space between these two theories. And what I found was people. People live in the interstitial space between theory. They are people's real lives, people's lived experience. And I wanted to sort of forward a practical proof of a theory's viability, right? Because theories are just theories if they're not viable, right? Even if they are viable, right? So I wanted to kind of think about what happens in between the space between, what happens in that space between thoughts. And what happens is life, right? And it's the same thing. I go back to what I said earlier about I wanted to have my children grow up in a space in which they value thought. But while they're valuing thought, what's happening for them? Life is moving forward, right? Exactly. And so I wanted to think about,
and we're in that moment now, right? With the ICJ and the ICC and what's going on. There are people dying while everyone else is hashing out the theory. There are real consequences to the delay of time which is a privilege of theory.
It's a privilege of theory. You think that you have time when you're theorizing, right? When everything is just not absolutely critical and vital and real. But in reality, there are people who are affected by the very visceral, very real effects of your waiting and of your theory.
Yes.
And of your thought life. And so I think that's the important thing, like to know when thought has to come to an end and when you have to really think about, not think about, when you have to do something. Thinking leads to action, ideally. It doesn't lead to this kind of hand-wringing paralysis that seems to be the current that we're living in.
Right. Right. And I also, thinking about what you said is like so powerful, right? Like people happen between these theories. And sometimes you can have two box office theories, like the ones you're talking about from Debord and Smith, and they don't meet until a poet or another theorist says, okay, I'm going to drag this line and tell you some stories where these two things touch. March 1969, that poem for me crystallized the violation of how Adam Smith's philosophy, right, is able in its dispersal into culture and the nuclear family idea, which is corporate, and it causes this devaluation, right? The daughters, the sole investment of the mother in this poem. There's this clear delineation between this lack of trickle down from the top, right? This corporatism, capitalist corporatism, and how it places a value on a mother, a father, a daughter, a son, and then the system that fails them because of racism, misogyny, and any other number of social ills. And I wanted to know how you were able as a poet to just so clearly draw that line, because it's so clear in several of the poems, but in March 1969, that stands out to me so starkly, that this is it's almost like the thesis for the whole thing for me.
Yeah, it is that intersection of where, for lack of a better cliche or aphorism, it's where the rubber meets the road. It's interesting because the term economics is derived from the Greek word oikonomia, which means household management. And my thought in making the book was that to understand the rules of one's home or household management governs your outlook outside of the home. And so inside my home, there was definitely a sense, my formative home, right? There was definitely a sense that the person was commodity. And I think that's partially owing to my parents' own upbringing. The commodity, and if you're a commodity, commodities are never autonomous. Commodities serve at the pleasure of others. And for a person to be viewed as commodity, it says so much about one's worldview, and importantly, how entrenched society is in production and in exchange of those commodities, even if that commodity is the body. There's still that production and there's still the exchange. So for me, I couldn't be in conversation with Smith or with Debord without considering the ongoing afterlife of commodification and embodied Blackness in America, whether in the home or outside, and how commodities are often fungible. They are exchangeable. You can change them out pretty easily. And I wanted the visual elements that are in the book, I wanted them to sort of convey how very unstable our relationship is between theory and reality, while still whispering the ways in which disequilibrium persists. The structure and the visual landscape of the book, they're kind of meant to enact the structural inequality that I'm sort of insisting is inherent in capitalism. Right. And I think you're right. I think March 1969 is sort of that poem that brings all of these thoughts, ideas to fore, and they bring them kind of in conversation with one another. Would you like me to read it?
Yes. I know.
Okay, I can't wait to read it.
No, I would love to hear it, like, now that we're talking about it, so everyone gets this idea of the whole entire book is incredibly powerful. But this is the first poem in the second poem in the first section. And it is what I said it is for it to come so early on. It's the bow around the whole of the exploration that you're making, and it's beautiful. I would love to hear it.
March 1969. Back at the church, the best man draped the groom's shoulders. Passed a flask of 100 proof. A mother fondled her fake pearls, walked the aisles in search of a soloist to replace the cousin who canceled an hour earlier. Will you sing His Eyes on the Sparrow or Amazing Grace? She asked each guest. Across town on Hanover Street, a young woman in a taffeta and lace gown huddled on the cold tile of a YWCA bathroom stall. She heard the lobby phone ring incessantly. The receptionist trumpeted her name over the intercom. She balled up wads of Angel Soft and blotted the Revlon fleeing her lash. For the last 2 hours, the cost of the dress, flowers, drinks, the soloist, the hall, and her mother's second mortgage to fund the matrimonial circus paraded across an embedded reel. Thoughts of a fatherless baby pushed her to decision. That inevitable bride called a yellow taxi to deliver her to fate. Outside, a homeless prophet touched her shoulder while she waited, reassured, "It's better for the baby girl, honey." 3 hours later, an understudy organist played the sorriest wedding march. The bride tripped down the aisle, busted her knee wide open, bled through her stockings and silk slip. Her groom, many swigs in, balanced by his best men, could barely stand. Her mother ran to the altar to lift her daughter, her sole investment, while an unholy congregation craned their necks and swished their church fans, advertising a local funeral home, to watch a lovely commodity reluctantly agree to her own barter.
When I read that poem, it reminded me of stories from women in my own family, right? As they move into their 60s, 70s,
Right.
There's this exegesis, this expression happening of them realizing only now that there are moments in their life where they did not have a choice. And Black
Right.
motherhood is so complicated because it's something we hold on high, but we're not ready to admit, no matter what our gender is, that a lot of our mothers were brought to being our mothers through force. Either the threat of being exiled de facto from their communities because they remained single for too long, didn't have children, weren't towing the line. And this is such a crystallization of how Black femininity is often what this system is expending rapidly without even thinking about who's going missing. And I wondered if you could say more about that connection between Black femme across like gender lines and how quickly our societies and institutions are ready to just spend it for even appearances or just the ego that's attached to having a position or a title in a family like uncle, father, mother.
Exactly. So it's interesting because I love that question and I love it for so many different reasons. But one of the primary things I love is that I once asked my mother, what would you be if you weren't a mom, right? Because her generation, it was interesting. Not only were they compelled to be mothers, but they were also compelled into certain industry, either teaching or nursing, or some other service related industry. It was never go be a tycoon, go be an artist, it was always be in service in some way to other people. Go forth and be a commodity of a different type. And so I kind of think about that all the time. And so one of the questions that I always ask women who are my mom's generation or above my mom's generation is, what would you have been if you could have been anything? You could have been anything. And this is not, it is not an assessment or it's not an indictment against their decision to be a mother. Right. But I think that we lose sight of the fact that Black women dream. Black women have dreams beyond what we can imagine, right? It's not just, I want to go do this, or it's not just the easily perceivable dream. It's that it's beyond it's beyond being a subject of policy. It's beyond being, it's beyond being the underdog. It's beyond being service. It's beyond all these things. Like maybe the vision was to be a punk or a weirdo or an indisposable, and whatever that looks like. And for me, that is such a tender and painful song. And I always want to be able to capture that in some way, because it is so critical to be able to say, so critical to be able to say, I want it other. I want it to be other. Before we started this conversation, it was off screen. We were talking about what it is to marginalize ourselves to some degree, right? Because we don't want to necessarily be inside of anything mainstream. And that's how I kind of view the margins. It's like outside of mainstream, which makes it something that I will almost always aspire to. I don't see anything wrong with being outside of a crowd. And the reason for that is because I think crowds are dangerous. And I think they've always been dangerous for Black women, particularly. And what is it to just assert one's individuality? And so that's what I do in my text, you know, constantly. I want to assert my individuality, whatever the hell that looks like, you know, however that may go. It's important for me to be myself fully. And it's taken me, I mean, I'm 50, I'll be 52. It's taken me probably 4 decades to get to the point where I can comfortably say that. And my hope and dream for Black women is that they can have that readily accessible to them. And I say Black women and Black femmes, because we can have that accessible to us at any time. We don't have to follow a script of who we're supposed to be or how we're supposed to be, or who we are supposed to be in service to. You know, it's like there's more than one way to be a domestic. You know, there used to be a time when all Black femmes would be able to do would be to clean somebody's damn house. Mm-hmm. And there's more than one way to be that person who always winds up cleaning someone's freaking house.
Well, it's that, and this is intergenerational, right?
It certainly is.
This is intergenerational. And what I'm seeing here is this long arc of being compelled to domesticity as a kind of domestication of one's humanity, right? Which is particularly done at the intersection of thinking about gender and class and race. Mm-hmm. When slavery ended in 1865, that was the work. Throughout all of our migrations of Black people, the women were the ones that migrated for the work, to do the domestic labor.
Do the work, right.
But this ended up being the crisis of the white feminism movement. Once you don't have someone in your house without liberty, compelled to do all the work for you.
Come on, you better preach up in here today.
It only took, 60, 50 years for them to start being like, I don't
want to do this shit.
Do this. I don't want to do slave work. And when you think of major art movements, like if you think about Woman House or Barbara Kruger, this is the complaint. I don't want to do the work of enslaved Black women. And I don't think I don't think my femininity is purpose to that. And in the 30s, the government paid for Black women to go do domestic labor during the Great Depression in the houses of white women that could not afford it. So there was this institutionalized maintenance of the cutting off of Black women's ability to individually express themselves. And when it did happen, not only did it come at the shock and dissatisfaction of people who identified as with the Black masculine, but as well as everybody else that said, I don't want to do the work.
Exactly.
And this Adam Smith's theory, you put it on the train of the different events of your life that you're willing to share with us and the different stories that you have. And it's just so clear. It's so clear. And I also want to talk about form, right? Like I want to talk about how form helps you through this. And I hope you don't mind. I want to share one thing, one poem that only you would know how to read, but this, can't get it. It's not coming through because the background.
Oh, I can see. Yeah.
Right. So it's the Debord's Deconstructed Spectacle After, and it's an image poem. And not only do I want to know about that in particular, but I want to know about your adventures in here with form. Because it's almost like Alice in Wonderland. A form is a new creature. It's a new life form that's able to redeliver this thesis you have in a new way. And so,
Absolutely.
as I said before we hit record, there's Norbisi Philip in this. There's a lot of Zong. There's a lot of Derricott. There's a lot of Wanda Coleman. Song not sung enough for her, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
As a woman who
mm-hmm.
decided to live a creative life. And so I just I experienced euphoria from experimentation and form. So I wanted to hear you say more about that and how form helped you through the task you gave yourself for this, for Bread and Circus.
Yeah. So for me, form is liberating, right? And which is why when I deal with form, I am adamant about trying new things on, because I don't think form is just what we've received, right? There are the received forms. There are these, you know, closed structures, whether it's a villanelle or a contrapuntal or whatever. I think that that's valid, right? Those are all wonderful things. But what I want to think about when I think about form is I want to think about how you're using the constraint, because form is constraint, right? So how you're using the constraint of space on the page. So if you're viewing the page as it is naturally constrained, you're writing between from margin to margin, top to bottom, left to right. And so how do we view what we can make in our individual canvas of the page? And so with this, I started thinking about, you know, when I was studying economics, the way that I could understand economics was to lend some language where there was no language. So I would summarize these charts or these graphs, and I would use, you know, short clips of, you know, probably like haiku-esque summaries of what I was understanding. And I wanted that to translate over into this book. Originally, I really wanted to have a series of graphs that showed what I was trying to do. But then as I was looking at Smith's language in The Wealth of Nations, I was like, nah, I want to overwrite this cat. And so I started thinking about the palimpsest as a form. So palimpsestic writing is simply overwriting an existing text. It's different than the erasure, right? Because a lot of people have said, oh, these are erasures. And I'm like, no, they're not actually erasures, because with the erasures, you cannot read the source text. I wanted the source text legible, except for that Du Bois poem where it's Du Bois' redacted spectacle after, because I wanted silence to follow. And so when you're looking at that, initially you're confronted with confusion, and then you fall silent, because there's nothing to read other than trying to make legible the symbols that are on the page.
Right.
And so I'm constantly thinking about everything that we see as some sort of form and how to make that legible in a poem. I don't know that I'm always successful with doing that, but I'm interested in experimenting with it. And I think that's the point of new form, is that it's all experiment. There's nothing that says that will outlive you and that form will take on its own life and become something beyond what you've written, right? Not every form is going to become the next Shakespearean sonnet, but you can view it as a way to say what you could not necessarily say otherwise. And so I can't, without causing great confusion, I can't necessarily read Adam Smith and then pluck my understanding of Adam Smith without causing some degree of confusion, but I can write it. And the way that I chose to write it was through the palimpsest. And then there's another read of those poems where, if you notice on the page, they're slanted.
Yes.
And they're slanted on the page because they're trying to give you some hints of echoes of kind of economic proofs, where you're searching, ideally in the kind of economic structure, you're searching for equilibrium.
Or searching for an objectivity that doesn't exist. The graph implements a kind of objectivity
that does not exist in the real world.
That does not exist in the real world, right?
Exactly, precisely. And so you can't help but end up in some sort of disequilibrious state. You know, you're going to experience disequilibrium. And so that's what I wanted to convey in those visual poems. And again, I think all poems are visual poems because you are using your field of vision as the primary constraint, just with the page. But that's what I was really trying to convey with these types of experiments, what I call them. And then in my first book, in Simulacra, It was thinking about the abbreviated text, how we abbreviate ourselves, how we kind of we begin to abort certain meanings because we're so taken with concision, and we get that from social media, right? So I introduced the idea of tweets and texts as a form of poetry. I think that's like a hill I'm gonna die on. I am always going to be trying out new forms because I just don't think some of the forms that I've received can hold what I'm trying to say.
To play.
And to play, right?
They're
How
so
important that
loaded.
is.
They're so loaded with their own kind of genealogy, their own legacy, that sometimes it will always kind of interrupt your voice.
Absolutely.
And you
Absolutely.
lose the element of play. One of the things that I wrote I wrote all over my copy.
So touching, thank you.
No, but at the bottom of the poem, on real costs, where you're doing this palimpsest, I was thinking about these theoretical texts almost like Bibles, right? Because they describe a certain way to believe in the world. And the words that you end up bolding, right, are the crystallization of the spell inside of the language, the craft that gets into your head, that's within the language, that's hidden by the run-on sentences, the putting of the subject behind the direct object, the style of writing that's so popular in academia, that's supposed to show mastery through difficulty, creating a difficulty for your reader or your average reader. And I guess I just, as a playful question, like, thinking about these kinds of texts as a form of craft, because so much of this is just thrown up to belief now. That's the way that it is. Oh, I believe in capitalism, right? No one can really say, oh, it works. They have to say they believe in it now, rather than it being a structure that's neutral that we could or could not do. It's a matter of morality now to practice it. How did you you spent years with it, so that's one way how, right? You're an expert in this.
Oh, that's sweet.
We're in the corporate world, right? But interpersonally, how did it feel to be able to use form to ascertain the spell work in the theory?
That's excellent. That's an excellent question. Probably one of the best questions I've had after the life of this book, after it came to market. But
thank
you. So much of a poem is spell work. It's a conjuring. And I think the more that you sit with any source text, the more the force of the text is reshaped by your understanding and your experience, which some people will say is bias. But for me, I believe it's a somatic experience. It's like, this feels right to me. Like, in my body, this feels right, or this feels truthful. And I guess, I think it's just sitting with it and letting the words, whatever word or series of words or phrases, seem to encapsulate what I understand in my body from that text. And I know that seems otherworldly, and we talked off camera about how so much of poetry, we talk about craft a lot, but so much of poetry in particular, I think, is intuitive.
Yes.
It's intuitive, and it's ahead of us. So you might write a poem, but that poem could be 5 to 10 years ahead of where you are. Yes. Meaning, in actuality, like, when
frustratingly enough,
the poems will tell on you, And so that's what I really wanted to experiment with in these poems, is like, how are these telling? How are these sort of the pieces of work that sort of served as sort of prophetic markers along the way for me? And some of those extractions were written before, of course, I mean, that's how collections come to be, but some of those extractions were written well before I knew what I was doing with the book. almost as a guiding point, like a source of a landmark.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how to say that any differently. I think one of the things I would counsel people about with poetry is you have to make space. You can read all you want, but you have to make space for the unnameable. You have to make space for the unknowable. You have to make space for language that you don't claim as your own. It's just in the world and it wants to come through you, so you let it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the experience of it for me. And it's interesting. I wanted to make those palimpsest poems be such that anybody can interact with them and have their own interpretation, because the source text is still visible, even if it's slightly less legible or slightly less readable than the highlighted sections. It's still there. And so I wanted folks to see how we translate text all the time, and we don't think that we are. We think that we're just, oh, this is what is written. No, it's written according to how you're translating it. Your understanding of it is tainted by how your lived experiences have influenced your reading.
Yes.
And so that's kind of what I wanted to convey to folks. Like, your lived experience, that practical piece enters into the theoretical piece, whether you know it or not. And then to make space for other people to have that same experience with those texts, with those particular poems. Again, except for Debord, because it's confusing and unreadable.
Right.
It's a distraction.
You're like, Cardinal here.
It is a purposeful distraction.
Yeah, my last question is about, you talked about mentorship and how important that is to you.
Mm-hmm.
And the publishing market is changing every day, right? Like, even in my own scope of visibility of how the market works, right? We had a model where, the marketing around your visibility was implied in a contract, whereas now you kind of have to have that built in on your own and have this ability to do this advanced work. And so young writers are really, in some respects, at the mercy of the changeability of AI and what data says is going to work, which is troublesome when it comes to what art we think should be promoted in the world, whether or not it already has a popularity to it. Because before it was, let's prepare our audience for this oncoming work rather than it's already digestible. So what is some advice you would give to those up and coming writers operating in such a fast, attention-driven marketplace? And what is something they should never lose sight of if they are going to reach the goal of publishing a book, or even just at having a handedness with their craft that they imagine for themselves?
Again, another exceptional question. I'm going to start with the last question first. Always know why you write, right? Are you writing to be accepted into the marketplace, or to be seen or viewed as a major writer in your time? Mm-hmm. Or are you writing past your time? Are you writing in such a way that your audience hasn't even been born yet? And I always think in the latter. I think I want to be writing in a way in which the people who are going to really understand and deeply regard the work maybe haven't been born yet. That's okay. And what that does for me is it helps me to contextualize not the importance of self, but the importance of the work, how work lives on past you. And I think that's critical. Really, this market crap is just that. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, you look at most major writers, and I say major, I don't even know what that means, but you look at the canon, Let's take Zora Neale Hurston, for example. She died penniless in a pauper's grave. You know, I don't think it was into the 70s after the Margaret Walker conference where they actually, sisters got together and gave her a headstone. Because what she was writing was important, you know, and sometimes it's not the market that defines your importance issue. It's how much you believe in your work. It's and how much you believe in its viability past you. And I believe that I'm, you know, are you writing to leave an imprint right now, or are you writing to leave a legacy after you? And I think that will guide you. I'm not judging either one. Some people are writing into the present and they just want to leave an imprint in the present. That's fine. As for me in my house, I want to leave a legacy. I want want my work to live past me, because our lives are far too brief in this grand scheme of things anyway. So I do caution writers to really think about, who are you writing for? Why are you writing? And are you writing for the work to live past wherever you are? And then the counsel that I would give is, man, we live in an age of just fast-paced nonsense and noise.
I mean, exploitation, you don't even know when it's happening to you.
You won't even know when it's happening.
You won't even know.
You know, and it's and it'll be happening quickly. I mean, we're all constantly being exploited. If you are online in any significant fashion, meaning at all, then you're being exploited. And you are complying to that exploitation. You're complicit in that exploitation. Now, can you make that work in your benefit? Yes, but you still have to know that you're being exploited at the end of the day. You just have to know that. Or at least one might want to know that, you know. And that may guide what you view as success. But I think use the tools that we have available to us. So I think it's important to, somebody told me this, it's a seer who I've had a close relationship to for a very long time. She passed away recently. And she said, you know, the real work comes in who you gift the work to, not who buys it. And she was like, that's the important decisions those are the important decisions you're going to make. Who are you gifting the work to? So I make sure that I gift the work to people, and I say, hey, if you like what you read, can you say a few kind words? And mostly in our industry, we're used to that. We're used to, and I say industry, I hate that word, but in our field, because man, at field is terrible too. You know what I'm saying? Like, all the words that describe business are just awful. Industry. I mean,
I think that what your book kind of like confirmed for me, especially after that conversation we had about like what the birth of white feminism comes from. Adam Smith was really just talking, globalization is the global expansion of the plantation economy, and who gets put in the field. I think I was at a Starbucks talking to a friend of mine, and I was like, well, you work from sun up to sundown. You leave your little house that's close to where you go work, and then you go work there all day. Then you come back to your little house and try to make time for your family. And if the government that's corporatized decides that you're doing something wrong, they'll take your children and give them to somebody. I was like, just because you have access to material goods doesn't mean that the exploitative nature of it has changed.
No, the more access you have, the more enslaved you are. I really believe that, honestly. And I'm not trying to diminish actual chattel slavery. What I'm saying is, you will be confined to people's views, how people distribute their resources. Don't get caught up in that shit. Just write. Right? Try to stay away from that as much as you can. Like, are you writing for industry? That word I hate. Or are you writing for generations past you? And that will govern a lot of it is changing your mindset. That will govern how your mindset shifts and morphs over time. You know, like a lot of times you get into anything, right? Because we're governed by a capitalist system. So we get into things because we want renown.
Yeah.
Can we as a people, can we set that aside and get into it because it's a passion? Get into it because we want to understand how to do this to the best of our abilities. Get into it because we have a message we want to share. Get into it because we want the promotion of the art rather than the promotion of the person. Can we do that? That's the harder work, right?
Under no question.
Yeah, exactly. Can we get into it because we have questions that we know other people have too, and we want to offer a potential view. It's not an answer. We don't have any answers. At the end of the day, if you're a poet that thinks you have an answer, you're a journalist.
I mean, so much of Black literature for me is exposing the spell work of white supremacy, whether it's poetry, whether it's theory. It's about exposing the spell work that led all of us away from having access to our humanity to differing degrees. And when we're focused on creating artistic messiahs, we miss that we are the ones that have been doing philosophy long enough to complete the labor of demystifying white supremacist reality.
Exactly. Period.
That's our job. That's our job.
That's the end of it. That's it. And you undo it slowly and surely, but you take it out scene by scene. That's the harder work, right? It
requires a lot of sacrifice. So much.
It requires sacrifice, and it requires that you disabuse notions of apotheos gods. They put on their whatever they wear in one leg at a time, just like you do.
Right.
So, and I'm not even trying to be holier than thou and saying we're elevating the art. It's beyond that. We're asking questions. These are questions that have been going on for generations. And we're trying to demystify it. We're trying to show you the way towards something, a light. It doesn't have to be the light. It's just a light.
Something to hold on to. Something to hold on to. Well, thank you, Airea. Thank you, everybody, for sticking with us through the conversation. I always feel incredibly blessed and honored when I'm able to be in deep conversation with a writer, a creator, a thinker such as yourself. We'll see you back here with Nicholas Goodley on June 28th for a conversation about his debut poetry collection, Black Swim. And until next time.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, everybody.